Have you ever wondered why the Vietnam War, a conflict that occurred half a century ago, still resonates so powerfully in our collective memory today? This war, which left an indelible mark on the world, is not just a chapter in our history books. It significantly shaped global politics, culture, and our understanding of warfare itself. The Vietnam War is a poignant reminder of the cost of conflict and the power of resilience. To understand this, we need to delve into the events of the Vietnam War as it unfolded. The Vietnam War started with what was known as the Domino Theory. This theory, coined during the Cold War era, suggested that if one country in a region fell under the influence of communism, its neighbors would follow suit, like dominoes toppling one after another. It was this fear of a red cascade through Southeast Asia that led the United States to become embroiled in Vietnam. But let's step back for a moment to consider the situation in Vietnam before American involvement. The French, who had colonized Vietnam in the late 19th century, faced a significant defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. This defeat marked the end of French colonial rule and set the stage for the division of Vietnam. The Geneva Conference that followed split Vietnam along the 17th parallel. The North, under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, embraced communism. The South, backed by the United States, clung to a more Western-style government. This division, however, was meant to be temporary, a stopgap until nationwide elections could be held. But when the South's leader, Ngo Dinh Diem, rejected these elections for fear of a communist win, the temporary division hardened into a permanent divide. With this division, the stage was set for one of the most brutal conflicts of the 20th century. Vietnam, a small nation on the Indochinese peninsula, would soon become the backdrop for a global power struggle between the forces of communism and democracy. The conflict escalated dramatically with the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. This was a pivotal moment in the Vietnam War, a spark that ignited the full-fledged military intervention of the United States in Vietnam. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was actually two separate incidents involving naval confrontations between North Vietnam and the United States in the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. The first occurred on August 2nd, when the USS Maddox, an American destroyer, reported being attacked by 3 North Vietnamese Navy torpedo boats. The Maddox retaliated, claiming to have damaged or sunk the enemy vessels. Just 2 days later, the Maddox and another destroyer, the USS Turner Joy, reported a second attack. However, this second incident was later thrown into doubt, with some suggesting it may have been a misinterpretation of radar images and not an actual attack. Nevertheless, these incidents were enough for President Lyndon B. Johnson to secure the Gulf of Tonkin resolution from Congress. This resolution essentially gave the president carte blanche to conduct military operations in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. It marked the beginning of the United States' direct military involvement in the Vietnam War. Following the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the US launched a series of bombing campaigns against North Vietnam, codenamed Operation Rolling Thunder. The aim was to demoralize the North Vietnamese and cut off their supply lines. But the bombing had the opposite effect, galvanizing the North Vietnamese and their resolve to fight. With the bombing campaigns proving ineffective, the US increasingly sent ground troops to Vietnam. From a mere handful of military advisors in the early 60s, the number of US troops in Vietnam swelled to over 500,000 by the end of the decade. Yet, despite the immense show of force, the war was far from won. The North Vietnamese and their allies in the South, the Viet Cong, proved to be tenacious adversaries. The war was escalating, with no clear end in sight. In 1968, the Tet Offensive marked a significant turning point in the war. This was a series of surprise attacks launched by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces on more than 100 cities and outposts in South Vietnam. It was named after the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, Tet, during which the offensive took place, defying a traditional holiday truce. The Tet Offensive was a military failure for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, as they suffered heavy casualties and did not maintain control over any of the targets they attacked. However, it was a psychological victory, shaking the confidence of the American public and military in their ability to win the war. Images and stories of the chaos, including the Battle of Hue and the attack on the US Embassy in Saigon, were broadcast back home, causing shockwaves through American society. The brutality of the war was now visible in living rooms across America, and many started questioning the US involvement in Vietnam. This shift in public sentiment led President Lyndon B. Johnson to reduce the bombing in North Vietnam and ultimately decline to seek re-election. His successor, Richard Nixon, initiated a policy called Vietnamization, which aimed to equip and train South Vietnamese forces to take over the fight while gradually withdrawing US troops from the region. However, this plan was easier said than done. Despite the decrease in US forces, the war raged on. South Vietnam's military had trouble fending off the North without American support, and the US was still deeply entangled in the conflict. The Tet Offensive was a turning point, not because it was a decisive victory for either side, but because it changed the perception of the war. It marked the beginning of the end of US involvement, but it did not mark the end of the war for the Vietnamese people. The tide was turning, but the end was still far from sight. By 1973, all US combat troops had left Vietnam, but the war was far from over for the Vietnamese. 2 years later, in 1975, the war reached its climax with the fall of Saigon. Saigon, once a bustling, vibrant city, the veritable jewel of French Indochina, had become the last bastion of South Vietnam. But it too fell to the North Vietnamese forces, marking the end of the war and the beginning of a new era. This was the final act of a tragic play, the end of a war that had torn a nation apart. The South capitulated, and Vietnam was reunified under the banner of the Communist North. But, as with any war, the end of the conflict was not the end of the story. The aftermath of the war was just as tumultuous, just as fraught with pain and struggle. The impact on the Vietnamese population was immense. Millions had died during the war, and those who survived were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The landscape had been scarred by bombing and defoliation. The economy was in ruins. And perhaps most devastatingly, the Vietnamese people were left with the memory of a war that had torn their country apart. And what of the legacy of the war in the United States? It was a war that had been highly controversial, a war that had sparked protests and divided the nation. The Vietnam War was a turning point in American history, a moment that challenged the nation's beliefs about itself and its role in the world. It was a war that forced America to confront the limits of its power, the consequences of its actions, and the human cost of its foreign policy. It was a war that left deep scars, scars that are still visible today. The Vietnam War was over, but its echoes are still felt today. So why does the Vietnam War still resonate today? Well, let's take a moment to review the key points we've explored in this discussion. We started with the domino theory and its role in the inception of the war. Remember how this Cold War concept, the fear that one country falling to communism would trigger a cascade effect, led the United States to intervene in Vietnam. The war, initially a civil conflict between the North and South of Vietnam, soon escalated to involve international powers. Then we delved into the escalation of the war, sparked by the Gulf of Tonkin incident. This event, whether fully accurate or exaggerated, served as the catalyst for the United States' full-scale involvement, marking a turning point in the narrative of the war. We then discussed the Tet Offensive, another pivotal moment. Despite being a military failure for the North Vietnamese, it shook the confidence of the American public and marked a shift in how the war was perceived, both domestically and internationally. Finally, we looked at the end of the war and its aftermath. The Paris Peace Accords marked the end of direct US involvement, but the war continued until the fall of Saigon. The war's aftermath was marked by a period of healing and reflection, as the world grappled with the human cost and ramifications of the conflict. The Vietnam War taught us many lessons. It reshaped the way we approach warfare and foreign policy, emphasizing the need for clear objectives and public support in any military engagement. It also highlighted the importance of understanding cultural and political contexts in international affairs. The echoes of the Vietnam War are still felt today in the way we approach conflicts, in the way we view the balance between power and diplomacy, and in the ongoing debate about the role of a nation in global affairs. The Vietnam War, a turbulent chapter in our history, serves as a reminder of the cost of conflict and the price of peace. If you enjoyed this video and have an interest in history, consider subscribing to this channel for more insightful content.